What can the paths we take reveal about our identities? Scholarly idea. Aspects of our individual identities are exposed based on how we travel the path. The choices we make reveal our identities, while these choices shape us further. By Chloe
Davis.
Gall, Grace.
On Trails. In the novel On Trails by Robert Moore, the author spends a great deal of time investigating this idea of how identity can be discovered through the various routes that each of us travel. Moore writes on page 25, hurried walkers make straight paths and leisurely walkers make curvier ones, just as some societies seek to maximize profit while others strive to maximize equality or military might or gross national happiness. By comparing hurried walkers to leisurely walkers, Moore introduces two very different identities of people who have experienced the same path differently due to their different characteristics. Because these two different types of walkers have different intentions, they make two different types of paths. Therefore, our identities help us form different paths, and at the same time, the way we walk our paths can reveal much about our identities. During my hike at Tumamoc Hill, I could apply this quote from On Trails to my own life. Moore talks about hurried walkers versus leisurely walkers. Some students chose to take their time and walk slowly, appreciating the current view. But on the other hand, some students chose to hike at a faster pace. For myself, I looked at the hike as a way to study and to work out simultaneously. This aspect of my identity was shown in the way I traveled my path at a quick pace and refused to stop until I reached the bottom once again. By the way I walked my path, I can now recognize aspects from my identity, such as motivated, athletic, and determined. I believe this says a lot about each of our identities as humans, and I felt that in this way, the activity for the week related to our research questions. This hike gave a first-hand view at the idea of how our identities are revealed through the path that we travel and specifically how we travel it.
My journey up Mount Lemmon was enlightening and helping me understand that the way paths are taken is just as important as the path itself. While driving up the mountain, I drove on my own, and the solitude shaped my experience as opposed to those who chose to travel as a group. When I chose trails to walk down and explore, I tried to find the highest and most lonely paths that I could so as to immerse myself in the depths of the forest. The way I chose to travel up the mountain reveals aspects about my identity as someone who prefers to soak in new things alone and deepen my own understanding of myself. This relates to our scholarly idea in the way that the journey up the mountain not only shaped our identities in its own way, but revealed aspects of ourselves through the way we journeyed. In the interactive documentary series, Do Not Track, the human relationship with technology is analyzed to highlight the way that your digital path reveals your identity to people and companies around the world. It provides social commentary and brings awareness to the willingness with which we reveal private information about ourselves. Every choice we make on a digital platform is tracked, so the path we take and the ways it shapes and reveals our identities is all recorded. So it relates to our scholarly idea perfectly through the way it presents not only the constant reveal of your identity, but also how it shows the way we shape our identities through the paths we take, even digitally.
In the poem Letter to Borges from Houston, Texas by Stephen Cosito, the narrator explains his experience of tripping and falling on the sidewalk through the lens of being blind. He explains that synesthesia occurs when he falls. Since he does not have the sense of sight, his other senses are constantly heightened. He experiences the fall differently than a person with sight would. This is a great example of a way someone's identity changes the way they experience a path. Part of this man's identity is his blindness, and this changes the way he experiences many of his other senses like taste, hearing, smell, and touch. One time last year, my grade went on a field trip to a blind museum, and it was interesting to see how much more intense all my other senses were when my sense of sight was taken away. We also learned how to navigate a cafe and flea market as a person with no sight. Paying for things was harder since we couldn't see what type of bills we were holding. It showed my classmates and I how differently blind people experience the world, and gave us a glimpse for an hour of all these nuanced details we never considered as a challenge. During the sound walk, many aspects of campus were more evident than usual. Most people probably don't take the time to stroll around campus and notice the little things, like all the water fountains and other drastic differences. We concluded that a more fast-paced person would not typically notice the scenery, especially not the small details surrounding them. However, a more laid-back person who is more mindful would notice these nuances about their surroundings. Again, an individual's identity changes the way they travel, which in turn shapes the things they experience on their travels.
In the humanities discipline, I read a poem called What We Mourn. In this poem by Sheila Black, the narrator talks about how people think being disabled is a pitiful and sorrowful thing. When the narrator points out that, I loved it as you love your own country, line 27, this proves the narrator identifies positively to being disabled and does not see it as a bad thing as some may see it as. This relates to our scholarly idea because it demonstrates how someone's path and the way they are living their life is based on how they want to perceive it and the choices they decide to make throughout their life. In the natural science discipline, I found an article called Where Does Identity Come From by Jason Castro. In this article, it talks about how Julia Freund conducted an experiment with mice that are identical with each other and they were placed in a common environment. The results of the experiment wanted to show whether or not differences would develop between the mice. To study their differences, Freund used roaming entropy, which shows how much you get out and what you get out of it. Over a few weeks, the mice roaming entropy was low, but as the experiment continued, they found some mice to be more exploratory than others. In the end, the study showed that the mice were known as the wanderers experienced the greatest proliferation of adult-born neurons. This study shows that there is room to be your own self and to be unique. Even if you have the same environment or you take the same path as someone, you will develop differently and take the path differently based on who you are and the way you were raised.
Here are the sources that we used for our final project.